The dust cloud rising behind the stagecoach told Sarah Thornton that her old life was disappearing with every mile that carried her westward into the Montana Territory, and the secret growing heavy in her belly would soon become impossible to hide. She pressed a trembling hand against her abdomen, feeling the flutter of movement that had become her constant companion these past months, a reminder of both her shame and her hope. The year was 1878, and proper women did not arrive in frontier towns alone, unwed, and carrying children conceived in circumstances too painful to speak of aloud. The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the primitive road, and Sarah gripped the worn leather seat to steady herself. Across from her sat an elderly woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. Abernathy, bound for her son's ranch near Billings. The woman had been studying Sarah with shrewd eyes since they departed from Miles City that morning, her gaze lingering on Sarah's loose traveling dress in a way that made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "How far along are you, dear, Mrs. Abernathy?" finally asked, her voice not unkind but direct in the manner of frontier women who had no patience for pretense. Sarah's hands instinctively moved to protect her stomach. "I don't know what you mean. I've birthed 7 children and helped deliver 24 more. I know a woman with child when I see one." Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice though there were no other passengers in the coach. "Where is your husband?" The word struck Sarah like a physical blow. "I have no husband." The silence that followed felt heavy as lead. Sarah waited for the condemnation, the righteous judgment that had driven her from her family's home in Boston 3 months ago. Her father, a respected banker, had given her enough money for passage west and told her never to return. Her mother had wept but said nothing, bound by her husband's decree. "Well then," Mrs. Abernathy said after a long moment, "I suppose you are heading to Copper Ridge to make a fresh start." Sarah nodded, grateful that the older woman had not demanded more explanations. "I have a position arranged at the boarding house. Mrs. Mackenzie wrote that she needs help with cooking and cleaning. Ada Mackenzie is a good woman. She won't turn you away, not like some might." Mrs. Abernathy settled back against the seat, adjusting her bonnet. "But you should know that Copper Ridge is a small town. Folks will notice soon enough and they will talk." "Let them talk," Sarah said, surprised by the fierce edge in her own voice. "I am done caring what people think of me." That was not entirely true, but Sarah was determined to make it so. She had spent 22 years being the dutiful daughter, the proper young lady, following every rule society had laid before her. It had earned her nothing but heartbreak and exile. Thomas Ashford, the young man her parents had approved of, the one they had expected her to marry, had taken what he wanted and then vanished when she told him about the child. Only it was not one child, as she had recently discovered. The midwife in Miles City, where Sarah had stopped to rest, had examined her and delivered the shocking news that she carried twins. The stagecoach rolled on through the afternoon, passing through valleys of tall grass that rippled like ocean waves in the constant wind. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still crowned with snow despite it being June. Sarah had never seen country so vast and wild. Everything about Montana Territory felt raw and unfinished, as though God had not quite completed the work of creation here. It terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. As evening approached, the coach pulled into Copper Ridge, and Sarah's first impression was of a town clinging stubbornly to existence in the middle of nowhere. The main street consisted of perhaps 24 buildings, most of rough timber construction. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with painted letters announcing it as the Silver Dollar, a small church with a modest steeple, and various other establishments lined the dusty thoroughfare. Men in work clothes and cowboys in leather chaps moved about their business, and a few women in simple calico dresses carried baskets or herded children along the wooden sidewalks. The stagecoach came to a halt in front of the stage office, and the driver climbed down to help his passengers disembark. Sarah accepted his hand and stepped down carefully, her legs unsteady after the long journey. She retrieved her 2 worn carpetbags from the boot of the coach and stood uncertainly on the sidewalk as Mrs. Abernathy was met by a tall man she introduced as her son. "The boarding house is 3 buildings down on the right," Mrs. Abernathy told Sarah before departing. "You take care of yourself, dear, and those babies." Sarah made her way to the boarding house, a 2-story structure that looked more substantial than many of the other buildings in town. A painted sign proclaimed it to be Mackenzie's boarding house, with the words rooms and meals painted beneath. Sarah climbed the steps to the front porch and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was perhaps 50 years old, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that assessed Sarah with businesslike efficiency. "You must be Sarah Thornton. I received your letter." "I am Ada Mackenzie." "Yes, ma'am, I am pleased to meet you." Ada Mackenzie stepped aside to allow Sarah entry. "You look exhausted. Come in and sit down. I will make tea." The interior of the boarding house was clean and simply furnished. Ada led Sarah to a kitchen at the rear of the building, where a large stove dominated one wall and a sturdy table occupied the center of the room. Sarah sank gratefully into a chair while Ada put a kettle on to boil. "Your letter said you had experience with cooking and housekeeping," Ada said as she prepared the tea, "but it did not mention your condition." Sarah's heart sank. "I am a hard worker, Mrs. Mackenzie. I will not let my condition interfere with my duties. I can work right up until my time comes, and then I will be back to work as soon as possible after." Ada set a cup of tea in front of Sarah and sat down across from her. "When are you due?" "Late September or early October," the midwife thought. "And the father?" Sarah's hands tightened around the warm cup. "There is no father. That is to say, there is no man who will claim responsibility." Ada studied her in silence for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I will not pretend to approve of how you found yourself in this situation, Miss Thornton. But I am not in the business of casting stones. I have a room you can have in exchange for your work. You will cook breakfast and dinner for my boarders, keep the common rooms clean, and help with laundry. The work is hard, but you look strong enough." Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Mackenzie. You will not regret this. See that I do not." Ada rose from her chair. "Come, I will show you to your room. We serve dinner at 6 o'clock, so you have time to rest before then." The room Ada showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the backyard. It was more than Sarah had dared hope for. She unpacked her few belongings and lay down on the bed, intending to rest for just a few minutes. But exhaustion claimed her, and she slept until Ada knocked on her door to wake her for dinner preparations. That first evening set the pattern for the weeks that followed. Sarah rose early to prepare breakfast for the boarders, a rotating cast of men who worked in the nearby silver mines or at the local ranches. She cooked hearty meals of bacon and eggs, flapjacks, beans, and whatever else Ada's budget and the limited supplies at the general store allowed. She scrubbed floors and washed dishes and changed linens on the beds in the 8 rooms that Ada rented out. The work was exhausting, especially as her pregnancy advanced, but Sarah welcomed it. Hard work left her too tired to dwell on her circumstances or to feel sorry for herself. The people of Copper Ridge took note of the new arrival, as Mrs. Abernathy had predicted they would. Sarah felt their eyes on her when she walked to the general store for supplies or attended Sunday services at the little church. She heard the whispers and saw the disapproving glances from some of the respectable married women, but she also found unexpected kindness. The young minister, Reverend Carlson, greeted her warmly and never asked uncomfortable questions. The proprietor of the general store, Mr. Hennessy, always treated her with courtesy. And Ada Mackenzie, though gruff in manner, proved to be a fair employer and gradually became something like a friend. It was in late July, when Sarah was well into her 6th month and could no longer disguise her condition, that she first encountered the cowboy who would change everything. She had walked to the general store to purchase flour and sugar, and as she emerged onto the sidewalk with her basket, she nearly collided with a man leading his horse to the hitching rail. He reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her elbow, and Sarah found herself looking up into a sun-weathered face dominated by clear gray eyes and a neat mustache the color of wheat. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, quickly releasing her arm and removing his hat. "I was not watching where I was going." "No harm done," Sarah replied, aware that several townspeople had stopped to observe the encounter. The cowboy's gaze flickered briefly to her swollen belly, then back to her face, and Sarah braced herself for judgment. But his expression held only polite concern. "You are all right. I did not startle you too badly. I am perfectly fine, thank you." He nodded and stepped aside to let her pass, and Sarah continued on her way, feeling his eyes follow her departure. She thought nothing more of the encounter until the following Sunday, when she saw the same man sitting in one of the back pews during the church service. He was dressed in clean clothes, his hair neatly combed, and he held his hat respectfully in his lap. When the service concluded, Sarah noticed several young women finding excuses to speak with him, but he seemed more interested in making his way toward where Sarah stood talking with Ada Mackenzie. "Mrs. Mackenzie," he said, nodding respectfully to Ada. Then he turned to Sarah. "We met briefly the other day, ma'am, but I did not have the opportunity to introduce myself properly. I am Nathaniel Cole. Most folks call me Nate." "Sarah Thornton," she replied, unsure what else to say. "Nate works at the Double R Ranch," Ada supplied. "He has been boarding with me on and off for the past 2 years when he comes to town." "I was wondering, Mrs. Mackenzie, if you might have a room available starting this week," Nate said. "The bunkhouse at the ranch is getting crowded with the new hands, Mr. Randolph hired for the summer, and I would appreciate a quieter place to stay when I am not working." Ada's eyebrows rose slightly. "I have room, but it will cost you more than the bunkhouse." "That is fine. I have been saving my wages, and I am willing to pay for some comfort and privacy." The arrangement was quickly settled, and Nate Cole became one of Ada's regular boarders, taking his meals at the boarding house and sleeping there several nights each week. Sarah soon learned that he was 26 years old, originally from Kansas, and had been working as a cowboy since he was 15. He was quiet by nature, never saying more than necessary, but what he did say was always thoughtful and kind. Unlike the other boarders, who largely ignored Sarah or treated her with barely concealed disdain once her condition became obvious, Nate always greeted her politely and thanked her for the meals she prepared. As July gave way to August, Sarah found herself increasingly aware of Nate's presence. She noticed the way he helped Ada carry heavy firewood without being asked, and how he fixed a broken step on the back porch one afternoon without expecting payment. She observed that he never drank to excess like some of the other men, and that he attended church regularly. Most of all, she noticed the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, his gray eyes holding an expression she could not quite decipher. One sweltering afternoon in mid-August, Sarah was hanging laundry in the backyard when a wave of dizziness suddenly overwhelmed her. She reached out to steady herself against the clothesline post, but her legs buckled. She would have fallen if strong arms had not caught her. "Easy now," Nate's voice said close to her ear. "I have got you." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing and carried her to the shade of the porch, setting her carefully in the rocking chair Ada kept there. "Stay here, I will get you some water." He returned moments later with a dipper full of cool water from the well. Sarah drank gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she held the dipper. Nate crouched beside the chair, his face creased with concern. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Sarah had to think about it. "Breakfast, I suppose. I have been so busy today." "It is past 2 o'clock. You need to take better care of yourself." There was no judgment in his tone, only genuine worry. "I have too much work to do to be sitting around eating," Sarah said, attempting to rise from the chair. Nate gently pressed her back down. "The work can wait a few minutes. Stay here while I finish hanging that laundry." Before Sarah could protest, he had walked over to the basket of wet clothes and begun hanging them on the line with surprising competence. Sarah watched in amazement as this cowboy, who surely had never done laundry in his life, carefully pinned sheets and shirts to the line, making sure they were straight and properly secured. When he finished, he returned to the porch. "I am going to make you a sandwich. Ada keeps bread and cold meat in the larder, and you are going to sit here and eat it. You do not need to do that." "I know I do not need to, I want to." He disappeared into the house before she could argue further. He returned with a thick sandwich of bread, beef, and cheese, along with another dipper of water. He stood over her until she began eating, then settled onto the porch steps, his back against the post, his hat pushed back on his head. "You work too hard," he said after a while. "I must earn my keep. Ada is getting her money's worth out of you and then some. Any fool can see that." He plucked a blade of grass from beside the steps and twisted it between his fingers. "You should not be doing such heavy work in your condition." Sarah stiffened. "My condition, as you call it, is my own business. I meant no offense." Nate looked at her directly, his gray eyes steady. "I only meant that carrying a child is hard work in itself. You should not have to do the work of two people on top of it." The kindness in his voice undid something tight and frightened inside Sarah's chest. To her horror, she felt tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. She turned her face away, mortified by this loss of composure. "I am sorry," she managed to say. "I do not know what is wrong with me." "There is nothing wrong with you." Nate's voice was gentle. "You have been dealt a difficult hand, and you are doing your best to play it with dignity. That takes more strength than most people ever have to show." Sarah wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "You do not know anything about me or my circumstances. You are right, I do not, and I am not asking you to tell me." He rose from the steps and dusted off his trousers. "But I know this much. You are a good woman who deserves to be treated with respect, and anyone who says different can answer to me." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Sarah staring after him in astonishment. No one had spoken to her with such simple, uncompromising respect since she had left Boston. No one had looked at her with anything but judgment or pity. But Nate Cole had done both, and something shifted in Sarah's heart, some frozen place beginning to thaw. The next day, Sarah came downstairs to begin breakfast preparations and found that someone had already brought in firewood and started the fire in the stove. Ada, looking as surprised as Sarah felt, said she had not done it. They both knew it must have been Nate, though he said nothing about it when he came down for breakfast. He simply ate his meal, thanked Sarah for the food, and went about his day. It became a pattern. Each morning, Sarah found the fire already started. Heavy bags of flour and sugar that she needed to lift would mysteriously appear on the kitchen counter instead of down in the cellar where they were stored. The pump handle that had been sticking was suddenly working smoothly again. Nate never mentioned these small acts of service, and Sarah did not know how to thank him without making the situation awkward. One evening in late August, when most of the boarders had gone to the saloon and Ada had retired early with a headache, Sarah sat on the front porch trying to repair a tear in one of her two serviceable dresses. The fabric was worn thin in places, and she knew she would soon need new clothes to accommodate her expanding figure, but she had no money for such luxuries. She would have to make do with letting out seams and patching what she had. Nate came up the porch steps, returning from wherever he had been. He paused when he saw her struggling with the needle in the fading light. "May I join you?" he asked. Sarah nodded, and he sat in the other rocking chair, stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a while they sat in companionable silence, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for the night. A piano jangled in the saloon down the street, and somewhere a dog barked. "How long have you been in Copper Ridge?" Nate asked eventually. 2 months now." "It feels both longer and shorter than that. And do you plan to stay?" Sarah's hands stilled on her sewing. "I have nowhere else to go." That is not the same as wanting to stay. No, Sarah admitted, but it is the reality of my situation. Nate was quiet for a moment. The father of your child, did he die? The question was asked gently, giving her an easy way out if she wanted to claim widowhood as so many women in her situation did. Sarah was tempted to take the escape he offered. But something about Nate's honest, open face made her want to tell the truth. No, he is alive as far as I know. He simply wanted nothing to do with me once I told him I was carrying his child. She forced herself to meet Nate's eyes. I am not a widow, Mr. Cole. I was never married. I am exactly what the respectable women of this town whisper that I am. She expected him to make excuses and leave, or perhaps to say something piously judgmental. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You know what I see when I look at you, Miss Thornton. I see a woman who made a mistake, like most people do at some point in their lives. But instead of hiding from it, or letting someone else deal with the consequences, you are facing it head-on with more courage than most men I know could muster. I see a woman who works harder than anyone should have to, who never complains, and who is trying to build a decent life for herself and her child in a place where the odds are stacked against her. That is what I see. And I think any man who could not see your worth was a fool who did not deserve you in the first place. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. Why are you being so kind to me? Nate sat back in his chair and a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Maybe because I recognize a fellow outsider. I have been on my own since I was 15, when my parents died of fever back in Kansas. I know what it feels like to have the whole world against you, to have to prove your worth every single day just to survive. And I know how much it matters when someone decides to see the best in you instead of the worst. Is that what you are doing, seeing the best in me? I am seeing the truth of you, and the truth is pretty admirable, Miss Thornton. Sarah looked down at the dress in her lap, blinking back tears. It is not one child. The midwife says I am carrying twins. She did not know why she told him this, the secret she had shared with no one in Copper Ridge except Ada. Perhaps because his kindness had breached her defenses, or perhaps because she needed someone to know, someone to share the weight of her fear and uncertainty. Nate absorbed this information in silence for a moment. Twins, he finally said. Well, that will be quite an adventure. That is one word for it. Terrifying is another. You will manage. You are stronger than you think. I am scared, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I am scared of the birth, scared of how I will care for 2 babies and still work enough to support us. I am scared that I will fail them, that I will not be enough. Nate rose from his chair and came to kneel beside hers, taking her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, and his touch sent an unexpected flutter through Sarah's chest that had nothing to do with the babies moving inside her. You will not fail them, he said firmly, and you will not be alone, I promise you that. You cannot promise such things, you barely know me. Then let me get to know you better. His gray eyes searched hers. Let me help you, Sarah, not because I pity you, but because I admire you. Because when I look at you, I see the kind of woman I would be proud to know, and the kind of mother those babies are lucky to have. No one had called her by her first name in months, not since she left Boston. The sound of it on Nate's lips, spoken with such warmth and respect, broke something open inside her. She turned her hand in his, gripping his fingers. Why? She asked. Why would you involve yourself in my troubles? Nate was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing his words carefully. Because I have been watching you for weeks now, and every day I find myself more impressed by you. Because when you smile at something Ada says, or when you serve breakfast with that determined look on your face even though I can tell you are exhausted, my whole day gets brighter. Because I have been a lonely man for a long time, and you make me feel like maybe I do not have to be lonely anymore. He paused, then added softly, because I am falling in love with you, Sarah Thornton, and I think those babies you are carrying deserve to have a father who will claim them and raise them with pride. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. You cannot mean that. You cannot possibly want to take on another man's children to tie yourself to a woman like me. A woman like you? You mean a woman who is brave and hardworking and kind, a woman who faces her troubles without flinching. Yes, Sarah, I want exactly that. He squeezed her hand gently. I am not asking you to marry me tonight. I know this is sudden, and you have no reason to trust any man right now. I am just asking you to let me court you properly, to give me a chance to prove that I mean what I say. Sarah wanted to say yes with every fiber of her being, but doubt held her back. What will people say? They already talk about me enough. Let them talk. I have never cared much about gossip, and I am not about to start now. And the babies? You truly believe you could raise them as your own? Nate's expression grew serious. I will not just raise them as my own, Sarah. If you agree to marry me, they will be my sons. I will claim them both, give them my name, and love them as though they were my own blood. They will never have cause to doubt that they have a father who wants them. Sarah realized she was crying again, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of hope, of possibility, of a future she had not dared to imagine. I do not know what to say. Say you will give me a chance. That is all I ask for now. Sarah looked into his honest, earnest face and made her decision. Yes, I will give you a chance, Nate Cole. The smile that broke across Nate's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. You will not regret this, Sarah, I swear to you. In the weeks that followed, Nate courted Sarah with a sincerity and dedication that gradually wore away her defenses. He walked with her to church on Sundays, his hand steady on her elbow as her balance grew more precarious. He sat with her on the porch in the evenings, talking about his life and listening with genuine interest as she gradually shared pieces of her own story. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Kansas, about the hard years after his parents died when he had to fend for himself, about the satisfaction he found in working with horses and cattle. Sarah, in turn, told him about Boston, about her strict upbringing and her parents' expectations. She told him about Thomas Ashford, the man who had courted her with pretty words and promises, who had persuaded her that they would be married soon enough that it did not matter if they anticipated their vows. She told him about her father's rage when her condition could no longer be hidden, about her mother's tears, about the money pressed into her hand, and the door closed firmly behind her. Nate listened to all of it without judgment, his hand holding hers, his presence a steady comfort. When she finished, he simply said, "Their loss is my gain. If they had been the parents they should have been, you never would have come to Montana and I never would have met you." As August faded into September, Nate began making plans for their future. He spoke to Mr. Randolph, the owner of the Double R Ranch, about increasing his responsibilities and his wages. He looked at a small piece of land on the edge of town that was for sale, envisioning a house they could build together. He talked about these plans with Sarah, always careful to include her opinions, never making decisions without her input. Sarah found herself falling in love with him, this quiet cowboy who saw her not as a fallen woman but simply as a woman worthy of love. She loved the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle strength in his hands, the careful way he spoke as though words were valuable and not to be wasted. She loved his absolute certainty that they could build a good life together, his unshakable faith in their future. One evening in mid-September, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Nate turned to Sarah and took both her hands in his. "I know we have only been courting a few weeks," he said. "But I also know that your time is getting close and I want those babies to be born with my name. I want you to be my wife, Sarah, properly and legally before they arrive. Will you marry me?" Sarah's heart was so full she could barely speak. "Yes, Nate, yes, I will marry you." They were wed the following Sunday in a simple ceremony at the church, with Ada Mackenzie and Mr. Hennessy from the general store serving as witnesses. Sarah wore the best of her two dresses, carefully altered to accommodate her swollen belly, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Nate had picked for her that morning. Reverend Carlson performed the ceremony with warmth and sincerity, never once alluding to the obvious fact that the bride was heavily pregnant. When Nate slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger and kissed her gently to seal their vows, Sarah felt as though she had finally come home. The disapproving stares of some of the townspeople who attended the service could not diminish her happiness. She was Sarah Cole now, a married woman with a husband who loved her and who had promised to be a father to her children. After the ceremony, Ada insisted on hosting a small wedding dinner at the boarding house. She prepared a feast of roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie, and several of the more open-minded townspeople joined them to celebrate. Mr. Randolph from the Double R came, clapping Nate on the back and telling Sarah she had married a good man. Mrs. Abernathy, the woman Sarah had met on the stagecoach, attended and pressed a beautifully embroidered baby blanket into Sarah's hands. That night, Nate carried Sarah over the threshold of the small room at the boarding house that would be theirs until they could afford their own place. He set her down gently, his hands lingering at her waist, and looked at her with such tenderness that Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears yet again. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," Sarah answered honestly. Nate cradled her face in his hands and kissed her with a reverence that made her feel cherished and precious. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you stay happy," he promised. They lay together that night in the narrow bed, Nate's arm around Sarah, his hand resting on her belly where their sons moved and kicked. Sarah had told Nate she was certain the babies were boys, though she had no way of knowing for sure. It was simply a feeling she had, and Nate had accepted it without question. "Have you thought about names?" Nate asked, his voice drowsy. "I thought perhaps you would want to name them after your parents." Nate was quiet for a moment. "My father was called James and my mother was Catherine." "James Cole has a good sound to it. And for the second, what was your father's name?" Sarah stiffened slightly. "Edward, but I do not wish to name either of our sons after him." "Then how about William?" "My grandfather was called William and he was a good man. I remember him being kind when I was small." "James and William Cole," Sarah murmured, trying out the names. "I like that very much." 2 weeks after their wedding, on a cool evening in late September, Sarah's labor began. She had been helping Ada prepare dinner when the first pain struck, sharp and unmistakable. Ada took one look at her face and sent one of the boarders running for the midwife while she helped Sarah upstairs. Nate, who had been at the ranch, arrived home to find chaos in the boarding house. He took the stairs 3 at a time and burst into the room where Sarah lay laboring, her face pale and beaded with sweat. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Brennan, tried to shoo him out, but Sarah reached for his hand. "Stay," she gasped. "Please stay." Nate looked to Mrs. Brennan, who shrugged. "It is not usual, but if she wants you here, you can stay. Just keep out of my way." Nate pulled a chair close to the head of the bed and took Sarah's hand, letting her grip his fingers with bruising force as the contractions intensified. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth and murmured encouragement as the hours passed and the labor progressed. It was near midnight when Mrs. Brennan announced that it was time to push. Sarah bore down with all her strength, crying out with the effort, and Nate felt utterly helpless watching her pain. But he held her hand and told her how strong she was, how proud he was of her, how soon they would meet their sons. The first baby emerged with a loud wail just after midnight. "A boy," Mrs. Brennan announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A good, strong boy." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she heard her sons cry, but there was no time to rest. The second baby was coming, and Sarah had to push again. This birth was faster, and within minutes another cry filled the room. "Another boy," Mrs. Brennan said with satisfaction. "2 healthy sons, just as you thought." The midwife and Ada worked quickly to clean and swaddle the babies while Sarah lay back exhausted against the pillows. Nate kissed her forehead, his own eyes wet with tears. "You did it," he whispered. "You were so brave, Sarah. I am in awe of you." When the babies were clean and wrapped in blankets, Mrs. Brennan placed them in Sarah's arms. Sarah looked down at the two tiny faces, so perfect and new, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. They had dark hair and screwed-up little faces, and they were the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "James and William," she said softly, "our sons." Nate reached out a tentative finger to stroke one baby's cheek, then the other's. His face held an expression of wonder. "They are perfect, absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold them?" Sarah asked. Nate looked terrified at the prospect, but he nodded. Ada showed him how to support their heads, and Nate took first one baby, then awkwardly managed to hold both, one in each arm. He looked down at them with such an expression of fierce protectiveness and love that Sarah fell in love with him all over again. "Hello, James." "Hello, William," Nate said softly to the babies. "I am your papa, and I promise you I will always take care of you and your mama. You are my sons, and I am proud to call you mine." In that moment, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. This man, this good and honest cowboy, would be the father her sons needed. He would raise them with love and integrity, and they would never need to know the shame of their true origins. They would simply be the Cole boys, sons of Nate and Sarah Cole, wanted and loved from their first breath. The weeks following the birth were exhausting but joyful. Sarah recovered her strength slowly, and Nate proved to be a devoted father, getting up with the babies at night so Sarah could rest, changing diapers without complaint, and walking the floor with a crying infant so that Sarah could tend to the other. Ada was a helpful presence, offering advice and assistance, and even cooking meals so that Sarah could focus on the babies. The townspeople's reactions to the twins were mixed. Some of the more judgmental women continued to whisper and cast sideways glances, but others softened when they saw Nate with the babies, his love for them obvious and unfeigned. It was hard to maintain righteous disapproval in the face of such genuine family devotion. Mr. Randolph came to visit when the babies were a week old, bringing a hand-carved cradle he had made himself. "Every baby needs a proper cradle," he said gruffly. "These boys are lucky to have a father like you, Nate." "I am the lucky one," Nate replied, and he meant it. As autumn deepened and the mountains turned gold and crimson, Nate began building their house on the piece of land he had purchased. It was just outside of town, with a view of the mountains and enough space for a garden and perhaps some chickens. He worked on it every spare moment he had, and on Sundays, weather permitting, he would take Sarah and the babies out to see the progress. By the time the first snow fell in November, the house was finished enough to move into. It was small, just 3 rooms, but it was theirs. Nate carried Sarah over the threshold once again, and then they brought the babies in, laying them in the cradle Mr. Randolph had made, which now sat beside the bed in the main bedroom. That night, as they lay in their own bed in their own house with their sons sleeping peacefully nearby, Sarah turned to Nate. "I need to tell you something," she said. Nate propped himself up on one elbow, concern crossing his face. "What is it?" "I love you," Sarah said simply. "I do not think I have said it properly before, but I love you, Nathaniel Cole. You have given me everything I thought I had lost: a home, a family, respect, hope. You have loved me when I did not think I deserved love, and you have claimed my sons as your own without hesitation. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Nate pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. "You already are worthy, Sarah. You always were. I am just grateful you let me be part of your life." He kissed her deeply, and Sarah melted into his embrace, marveling at how safe and loved she felt in his arms. The winter months tested them in new ways. Montana winters were harsh, and keeping the small house warm while caring for 2 infants was challenging. But they faced each difficulty together, growing closer with every hardship overcome. Nate proved to be a natural father, patient with the babies even when they cried for hours, singing them silly songs to make them smile, teaching Sarah how to laugh again. James and William thrived, growing plump and healthy. James was the quieter of the two, content to lie and observe the world with serious eyes. William was more demanding, quick to cry when he wanted attention, but just as quick to smile. Sarah loved them with a fierceness she had never known she possessed, and watching Nate with them filled her with joy. One evening in January, when the babies were nearly 4 months old, Nate came home from the ranch with news. "Mr. Randolph is making me foreman," he announced. "It means more responsibility but also more pay. Enough that you will not have to go back to work at the boarding house if you do not want to." Sarah had been dreading the thought of leaving the babies to return to work. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. We will manage just fine." Nate scooped up William, who had been fussing in his cradle, and bounced him gently. "Your mama gets to stay home with you boys. What do you think of that?" William's response was to grab a fistful of Nate's hair and yank hard, making Nate yelp. Sarah laughed, the sound coming easily now, and reached over to disentangle William's surprisingly strong grip. As winter gave way to spring, the Cole family settled into a rhythm. Nate worked long days at the ranch but always came home to his family, never stopping at the saloon or staying away longer than necessary. Sarah tended the house and the babies and began planting a garden once the ground thawed. James and William grew and changed daily, becoming more alert and interactive. On a warm evening in May, when the babies were 8 months old and beginning to crawl, Sarah stood in the doorway of their house watching Nate play with his sons in the front yard. He was on his hands and knees, pretending to be a horse while the twins crawled after him, giggling with delight. The sight filled Sarah with such contentment that she found herself blinking back happy tears. Nate looked up and caught her watching. He stood, brushing dust off his knees, and came to join her in the doorway, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is now from what I imagined it would be," Sarah said. "A year ago I was terrified and alone, carrying babies I did not know how I would provide for. I thought my life was over, that I would never know happiness or love again. And now I have everything. A husband who loves me, 2 beautiful sons, a home. I am happier than I ever was in my old life, happier than I ever thought possible." She turned in his arms to face him. "You saved me, Nate, you and your generous heart." Nate shook his head. "You saved yourself, Sarah. You were brave enough to start over, to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. I just got lucky enough to be there when you needed someone." "We both got lucky," Sarah said, and kissed him. Behind them, William made a sound of protest at being ignored, and they broke apart laughing. Nate went to scoop up both babies, one on each hip, and carried them inside for dinner. As the months passed, life continued to be good. James and William learned to walk, wobbling around the house and yard on unsteady legs while Sarah watched anxiously, and Nate encouraged them to keep trying. They spoke their first words, "Mama" and "Papa," within days of each other, and Nate's face when William called him Papa was something Sarah would never forget. The people of Copper Ridge gradually accepted the Cole family as one of their own. Nate's reputation as a hardworking, honest man helped, as did Sarah's quiet dignity and the obvious love in their family. The whispers died down, and eventually most people seemed to forget or stop caring about the circumstances of the twins' birth. When the boys were nearly 2 years old, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was different, wanted, planned, conceived in love within the sanctity of marriage. When she told Nate, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with joy before remembering her condition and setting her down carefully. "Another baby," he marveled. "Are you happy about it?" "So happy," Sarah assured him. "Are you?" "I could not be happier if I tried. Though I hope this time it is just 1 baby. 2 at once is quite enough excitement." This pregnancy was easier than her first, perhaps because Sarah was not burdened with fear and shame, or perhaps simply because she was more experienced. She continued her daily routines, caring for James and William and tending the house and garden while her belly grew. Nate was protective and attentive, always making sure she was not overexerting herself. In the spring of 1880, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after Nate's mother. The birth was easier than the twins had been, and Nate was there holding Sarah's hand throughout, just as he had been before. When Mrs. Brennan placed the baby girl in Sarah's arms, Nate looked at his daughter with such tender love that Sarah's heart melted. "A daughter," he said softly, stroking the baby's downy hair. "We have a daughter, Sarah." James and William, now 2 years old, were fascinated by their new sister. They wanted to touch her constantly, to hold her, to be involved in her care. Nate showed them how to be gentle, how to touch her softly, and the boys took their roles as big brothers seriously. Life fell into a new pattern with 3 children. The house seemed smaller and louder, filled with the sounds of children playing and crying and laughing. Nate added on another room to give them more space, and Sarah's days were filled with the endless tasks of caring for 3 small children. It was exhausting and overwhelming at times, but it was also exactly what Sarah had always wanted without knowing it: a real family, bound together by love. On their 2nd wedding anniversary, Nate surprised Sarah with a gift, a locket on a delicate gold chain. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, one of Sarah and one of Nate with all 3 children. "So you will always have us close to your heart," Nate said as he fastened it around her neck. Sarah touched the locket, her eyes filling with tears. "I love it. I love you." "Thank you for giving me this life, Nate." "Thank you for trusting me enough to share it with me," Nate replied. They had come so far from that day when Sarah had nearly fainted in the yard and Nate had caught her. She had been a frightened, pregnant, unwed woman with no hope for the future, and he had been a lonely cowboy looking for something more than the life he had. Together, they had built something beautiful: a family, a home, a life filled with love and purpose. As the years passed, the Cole family continued to grow and thrive. James and William grew into sturdy, active boys who idolized their father and followed him around the ranch whenever they were allowed. Catherine became a bright, cheerful little girl with her mother's determination and her father's kind heart. Sarah and Nate added 2 more children to their family, another daughter named Ada after Mrs. Mackenzie, who had given Sarah a chance when few others would, and finally a son they named Thomas, not after Sarah's faithless former suitor but after Nate's grandfather on his mother's side. The house was expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and the land around it was developed into a proper small ranch. Mr. Randolph, who had no children of his own, began grooming Nate to eventually take over the Double R, and Nate proved himself more than capable of the responsibility. Sarah sometimes thought about her parents in Boston and wondered if they ever thought about her, if they ever regretted casting her out. She had written to them once after Catherine was born, sending a letter with a photograph of herself, Nate, and all 3 children, letting them know she was well and happy. She received no reply and she did not write again. They had made their choice and she had made hers. She did not regret it. James and William never knew they had been born before their parents' marriage. As far as they were concerned, Nate had always been their father, and there was no reason to tell them differently. They grew up secure in the knowledge that they were loved and wanted, and they never had cause to question their place in the family. On a warm summer evening when James and William were 10 years old, Sarah stood on the porch of their now substantial house watching Nate teach the twins how to rope a fence post. Catherine, 8 years old, sat beside Sarah shelling peas, while 5-year-old Ada played with dolls at their feet. 3-year-old Thomas toddled about the yard, getting in everyone's way and being generally adorable. Nate caught Sarah watching and grinned at her, that same smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. He said something to the boys, then walked over to the porch, climbing the steps to stand beside Sarah. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist in the familiar gesture that still made her heart flutter. "About how grateful I am," Sarah said. About how different my life could have been if you had not caught me that day in the yard. I think we were meant to find each other, Nate said. I think God had a plan all along, even when things seemed darkest. Do you ever regret it? Taking on another man's children, marrying a woman with such a scandalous past. Nate turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his gray eyes serious. Not for one single second, Sarah Cole. Those boys are my sons in every way that matters. They have my name, my love, and my protection. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me. I thank God every day that you let me into your life. Sarah reached up to cup his face in her hands. I am the lucky one. You gave me back my life, my hope, my happiness. You gave me a family and a home and love beyond measure. I will never be able to thank you enough for that. Then do not thank me, Nate said, pulling her close. Just keep loving me and let me keep loving you. That is all the thanks I will ever need. He kissed her then, long and sweet, while their children played around them and the Montana sky turned gold and pink with the setting sun. It was a perfect moment in a life full of them, a life that had started in shame and fear but had blossomed into something beautiful beyond measure. Sarah had been carrying twins with no husband, facing a future that seemed hopeless. And then a cowboy had said he would claim them both as his own sons, and everything had changed. Nate Cole had given her more than just his name and protection. He had given her his heart, his loyalty, and his unwavering love. He had proven that family was not always about blood, but about choice and commitment and love. Years continued to pass in a blur of busy, happy days. James and William grew into fine young men, inheriting their father's work ethic and integrity. They were inseparable as boys and remained close as they matured, working alongside Nate on the ranch and learning everything he could teach them. Catherine became a beautiful, strong-willed young woman who had her mother's fierce independence and her father's kind heart. Ada was gentle and artistic, always drawing or painting the world around her. And Thomas, the youngest, was a perfect combination of all his siblings, with James's seriousness, William's humor, Catherine's determination, Ada's sensitivity, and both his parents' capacity for love. When James and William were 16, Nate finally told them the truth about their birth. He did it carefully, choosing a quiet evening when the younger children were asleep, and Sarah was there beside him. He explained that he was not their biological father, but that he had loved them as his own from the moment he met their mother, and that claiming them as his sons had been one of the greatest privileges of his life. The twins absorbed this information with surprising calmness. James, always the more serious of the two, was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You are our father in every way that matters, Pa. Nothing changes that." William nodded in agreement. "Some men father children by accident. You chose us on purpose. That makes you more our father than the man whose blood we share could ever be." Sarah, who had been terrified of this moment for years, wept with relief and gratitude, and Nate pulled his sons into a fierce embrace, his own eyes wet. "I am proud to be your father," he told them. "You have both become fine men, and I could not love you more if I tried." Nothing changed after that conversation. James and William continued to call Nate Pa and never expressed any interest in finding out more about their biological father. As far as they were concerned, the story of their family began the day their mother arrived in Copper Ridge and met a cowboy who saw past scandal and shame to the woman beneath. When Mr. Randolph died at the age of 78, he left the Double R Ranch to Nate, who had been running it for years by that point. It was a substantial legacy, making the Cole family one of the most prosperous in the region, but prosperity did not change them. Nate continued to work hard every day, and Sarah continued to manage their household with the same competence she had always shown. They raised their children to value hard work, honesty, and kindness above wealth or status. James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread when he was 22, and William followed suit a year later, marrying a schoolteacher who had come to Copper Ridge from Denver. Both young couples built houses on coal land, and soon Sarah and Nate were grandparents, delighting in the arrival of a new generation. Catherine surprised everyone by becoming a writer, publishing articles, and eventually a novel about life in the Montana Territory. Ada married a banker from Billings and moved to that growing city, though she visited often, and her paintings of Montana landscapes became highly sought after. Thomas, the youngest, chose to become a doctor, studying in Chicago before returning to Copper Ridge to set up a practice, serving the community that had been his home all his life. Through it all, Sarah and Nate remained the center of their family, the foundation on which everything else was built. Their love, which had begun in such unusual and difficult circumstances, had only deepened with time. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains, talking about their day and planning for the future. They still held hands like young lovers, still looked at each other with affection and desire even after decades of marriage. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled the house and yard, and the air rang with laughter and conversation. A photographer was hired to take a family portrait, and Sarah and Nate stood at the center of their clan, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the family had dispersed to their various homes, Sarah and Nate sat together on their porch, just the two of them in the gathering twilight. 25 years, Sarah mused. Can you believe it has been so long? Some days it feels like yesterday that I first saw you walking to the general store, brave and determined despite everything you were facing, Nate said. Other days, I cannot remember what my life was like before you. Do you remember what you said to me that night on Ada's porch? When you told me you would claim the twins as your own sons. I remember every word of that conversation. It was the night I started believing I might have a chance with you. Sarah smiled. I thought you were either crazy or a saint. I could not understand why anyone would willingly take on such a burden. You were never a burden, Sarah. You and those boys were a gift. You still are. Nate pulled her close and she rested her head on his shoulder. We have had a good life, have we not? Sarah asked. The best life I could have imagined. Better than I deserved. You deserved everything good that has come to you, Nathaniel Cole. You are the best man I have ever known. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of their ranch settling down for the night. The lowing of cattle in the distance, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of wind through the grass. These were the sounds of home, of a life well lived, of dreams realized. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met? Nate asked. Sometimes, Sarah admitted. But not with regret. I truly believe we were meant to find each other. My path to you was difficult and painful, but I would not change it because it brought me here to you, to this life we have built. I feel the same way, Nate said. He kissed the top of her head. Every choice I made, every hardship I faced, it all led me to that day when you nearly fainted in Ada's yard and I caught you. That was the day my real life began. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah thought about the frightened young woman she had been when she arrived in Copper Ridge all those years ago. She had been carrying twins with no husband, facing an uncertain future with nothing but her own determination to see her through. She had expected judgment and hardship, and she had found both. But she had also found something she had not expected, a cowboy with a generous heart who saw her worth when she could not see it herself. Nate Cole had not just claimed her twins as his own sons. He had claimed her heart, her future, her very self, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift possible, a second chance at happiness, at love, at life itself. He had proven that love was not about circumstances or timing or following the rules. It was about choice, about commitment, about seeing someone for who they truly were and loving them anyway. Their love story was not conventional. It had begun in scandal and desperation, with a pregnant woman fleeing her past and a lonely cowboy looking for purpose. But it had grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that had produced a family, a legacy, a life filled with love and meaning. As Nate helped Sarah to her feet and they walked inside together, arm in arm, Sarah sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. She had been lost and he had found her. She had been broken and he had helped her heal. She had been alone and he had given her a family. The years continued to pass gently for Sarah and Nate Cole. They watched their grandchildren grow, delighted in the arrival of great-grandchildren, and remained active in the life of Copper Ridge and the surrounding ranching community. Nate, though his hair turned silver and his face became more weathered, never lost his strength or his gentle nature. Sarah, her beauty maturing into elegant grace, remained the heart of their family, the one everyone turned to for advice and comfort. When they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, James and William stood together to make a toast. William, always the more verbal of the twins, raised his glass and said, "To our parents, who showed us that love is not about how you start but about how you continue. Pa, you chose us before we were even born and you have been the best father any sons could ask for. Ma, you gave us life and taught us strength. Together you have shown us what a marriage should be, a partnership built on respect, trust, and unwavering love. We are who we are because of you both." James added quietly, "You saved each other, and in doing so you saved us too. We will always be grateful." There was not a dry eye in the room as the entire family raised their glasses in agreement. Sarah and Nate lived to see their 50th wedding anniversary, a milestone few couples in the rough Montana territory achieved. The celebration was grand, with people coming from all over the region to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in Copper Ridge. Their story had been told and retold over the years, the tale of the cowboy who claimed another man's twins as his own and built a family based on love rather than blood. Nate passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Sarah holding his hand. His last words to her were, "Thank you for letting me love you. It was the greatest adventure of my life." Sarah lived for 2 more years after Nate's death, cared for by her children and surrounded by the family they had created together. She spent her final days sitting on the porch of the house Nate had built, looking out at the mountains they had both loved, remembering the life they had shared. When Sarah passed away at the age of 77, she was buried beside Nate on a hill overlooking their ranch. Their joint headstone reads simply, "Nathaniel and Sarah Cole, they chose love," and beneath that, "Beloved parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, their legacy lives on," and it did live on. The Cole family remained prominent in Montana for generations, known for their integrity, their industry, and their fierce loyalty to one another. The story of how the family began, with a desperate woman carrying twins and a cowboy who saw past scandal to the person beneath, became part of family lore, told to each new generation as a reminder that love could triumph over any obstacle. That family was defined by choice as much as by blood, and that second chances were worth taking. James and William Cole's descendants never forgot that their family line had been saved by one man's willingness to claim children who were not biologically his, to see potential where others saw only shame, and to offer love without conditions. They strived to live up to Nate's example, to see people for who they truly were rather than for their circumstances, and to extend grace and kindness whenever possible. The house Nate built was maintained for over a century, eventually becoming a historical landmark, a testament to one family's enduring legacy. Visitors would walk through the rooms where 5 children had been raised, where love had overcome adversity, where a frightened young woman had found safety and a lonely cowboy had found purpose. And always, guides would tell the story of Sarah and Nate Cole, emphasizing not the scandal of how they met but the beauty of what they built together. It was a story that resonated with people from all walks of life, because it spoke to universal truths about love, redemption, and the power of choosing to see the best in one another. In the end, Sarah Thornton, who arrived in Copper Ridge as a disgraced woman carrying twins with no husband, became Sarah Cole, beloved matriarch of a family that would span generations and touch countless lives. And Nathaniel Cole, a lonely cowboy looking for something more than the life he knew, became the father not just of 5 children but of a legacy built on love, compassion, and unwavering commitment. They had both been searching for something when they found each other, Sarah for safety and acceptance, Nate for purpose and family. What they discovered was far more than they had been looking for. They found in each other a partnership that would sustain them through decades of challenges and triumphs, a love that would deepen with every passing year, and a shared purpose in building a family and a life that honored the best in both of them. Their story began with a simple act of kindness, a cowboy catching a pregnant woman who stumbled, helping her when she needed it most. But that small act of compassion grew into something magnificent. A marriage that lasted 50 years, a family that thrived for generations, and a legacy of love that proved more powerful than any scandal or hardship. When historians later wrote about the settling of the Montana Territory, they documented the ranches and towns that were built, the mines that were dug, and the railways that were laid. But the real story of the West was in families like the Coles, ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances with courage and grace, who built lives of meaning and purpose in a hard and unforgiving land, and who proved that love and commitment could overcome any obstacle. Sarah and Nate Cole's love story was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the daily choice to love, to commit, to see each other through good times and bad. It was about a man who said, "I will claim them both as my own sons," and meant it with every fiber of his being. It was about a woman who was brave enough to accept that offer, to trust again after being betrayed, and to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy they left behind, not wealth or property, though they had accumulated both, but the example of how to love well, how to build a family on a foundation of mutual respect and unwavering commitment, and how to create something beautiful out of circumstances that began in pain and fear. Their descendants, scattered across Montana and beyond, carried that legacy forward, each generation finding inspiration in the story of how their family began. And always, when life presented them with difficult choices or challenging circumstances, they would remember Sarah and Nate, and they would choose love, just as their ancestors had done on a dusty street in Copper Ridge so many years before. The twins, James and William, had been given the greatest gift any children could receive, parents who loved them unconditionally, who raised them with pride and joy, who never made them feel like anything other than wanted and cherished. The fact that Nate was not their biological father was irrelevant. He was their father in every way that mattered, in love, in devotion, in presence, in guidance. He had claimed them as his own and never once wavered from that claim. And Sarah, who had arrived in Montana broken and ashamed, had discovered that her past did not define her future, that mistakes did not have to be permanent, and that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. She had given her children not just life, but an example of resilience, of grace under pressure, of how to face adversity with dignity and emerge stronger on the other side. Together, Sarah and Nate Cole proved that families could be built on foundations other than convention, that love was a choice made daily rather than a feeling that appeared and disappeared, and that the circumstances of one's beginning did not determine the worth of one's life. They showed that second chances were real, that people could change, and that kindness and compassion had the power to transform lives. As the sun set on the Montana landscape they had loved so well, as seasons turned and years passed and generations rose and fell, the story of Sarah and Nate endured, a testament to the power of love to overcome any obstacle, to heal any wound, and to create beauty from even the most unpromising beginnings. It was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the wild and beautiful American West, and it continued to inspire all who heard it to believe in second chances, in redemption, and in the transformative power of unconditional love.